Holy Week, the week leading up to Easter, when we recall the suffering and death of Jesus, we call Holy Week because of the wonderful thing that was happening and is happening now. It's not just a recalling like we do for an anniversary or centenary. Do you remember recently we had a centenary of the beginning of the First World War? And so we get out pictures and memories and try to reconstruct and get back to what happened then. But when we recall the Passion of Christ, we're not just going back to what happened years ago. Jesus is with me as I pray. He is present and something happens to me while I'm doing it. You've probably heard the expression, the imitation of Christ. The imitation of Christ isn't normal. When you imitate, you don't sort of read the gospel and say, Jesus did this, so I'm going to do it. It's not imitation in that sense. The imitation of Christ is something happens to me in which I become more like Christ, at the same time becoming more myself. And the prayer isn't my doing it or trying to become like Christ. I'm meditating on what happened to Jesus. I think about that, and the power of Christ takes over. And the imitation is how the way Jesus changes me. It's not a meditation on suffering itself, you know. You're not bound to believe that Jesus suffered more than anyone else has. It's not a question of that. It's a meditation on love. Just to watch a man suffering, no, that isn't any good. But to see that, perhaps you can say, the amount he suffered willingly expresses how much he loved me, helps me to realize it. And I believe, because a lot of saints say this, that Jesus would do that again today for me if it helped. And as if there was no one else. A very personal love. He loves me and he loves you so personally like that he would go through crucifixion, it would help. And as we think about it, what happened to Jesus then, as an expression of his love, something happens to me as I do it. But I don't focus on myself. When you meditate on the Passion of Christ, simply focus entirely on Jesus. And one way of doing it is taking different people who were there at the time, seeing how it affected them or how their presence affected Jesus. Remember Peter, one of his closest friends. Well, take two of them, Peter and Judas. Interesting. They were both warned on Thursday night, the night before Jesus died. They were both warned by Jesus that they would betray him. And they both betrayed him. And they both wept bitterly afterwards. So why do we call Peter a saint and Judas a traitor? It wasn't really what they did, but the effect it had on them afterwards as a result. Judas wept when he saw how low he'd sunk and how rotten he'd become. Peter wept because he saw that Christ was hurt. When we're sorry for things we do, it's a mixture of that sometimes. I'm sorry to a certain extent that someone's been hurt by what I did, and I'm sorry because of what they're going to think about me and what people are going to say and so on, or why, they'll blame me and so on, Those are the tears of Judas. I pray that I may have the tears of Peter and be sorry simply because of the hurt I've done to Christ, not because of what happens to me. Another interesting person who was at the Passion there, a man called Simon, who came from Cyrene. He happened to be coming home from work, and they grabbed hold of him and made him carry the cross. And I think he must have been very bitter. The law was, the Roman law, that a man had to carry his own cross. And because Jesus couldn't manage it, because he'd weakened by scourging, they grabbed this other man. I can imagine the man being furious. It's totally unjust. Why can't he carry his own cross? And I think at first then he would have turned in annoyance to Christ. But it also says in the Gospel that his two boys, Alexander and Rufus, were well-known Christians. So something happened to that man. If it happened while he was carrying the cross, no one would see any difference. It'd be the same cross. They're just going along. It's no lighter or heavier than before. But for Simon, it had become totally different, the way he carries it. In fact, Jesus has a wonderful expression, take my yoke upon you. It's become a yoke. You know, a yoke can be a thing for carrying pails of water and so on your shoulders. But a yoke for two animals, if a man is ploughing with two oxen or horses or something, if they're not yoked together, it'll be all over the place. They have to get in step. And Christ said, take my yoke on you. And once Simon accepted that that cross was joining him to Christ, it was totally different, and different for Christ. And who set the pace? Who decided how fast they're going? The soldiers are trying to get them to go on as quickly as possible. But between Simon and Judas and Jesus, if one wants to go faster, the other will try to adapt, and so on. They get in a harmony together. If I can get you into a harmony with Jesus, that would be powerful. What you might call a sympathy, not pity, a sympathy. You could have a sympathy in his joy or sympathy in his hurt. But here a sympathy, a symphony is when instruments are in tune with each other. My sympathy with Christ is when I'm in tune with Christ. So that when a cross comes, and I'll get a cross or I'll get hurt, instead of just grumbling about it or pushing it away, if any hurt is coming, I try to get rid of it. I don't look for it, I don't want it. But when it comes, if I'm ill or I have a loss or something really hurting me, I try to offer it with Jesus. Lord, I offer this suffering in union with you. I want to walk with you, to carry your yoke, the two of us together. Another person like that doesn't come in the Gospel. A very early tradition is that there was a woman called Veronica. Mind you, the name Veronica means a true image. The story is that a woman came along and wiped Jesus' face as he was carrying the cross. And when she looked at the towel or whatever she had, a clear image of his face was printed on the towel. If she went to wipe his face, well, she'd have to get something to do. Either she had a towel or she had to buy one or borrow one or go home and get one or use a veil. She had to find a place to do it. She had to overcome her shyness. But what a difference it made to Jesus to receive tenderness at such a moment. And what a difference it made to Veronica. The image on the towel was nothing compared with the image on her, the impression made on her heart. She would never be the same woman again. Never again would she be afraid to wipe the face of a man in pain, and every time it would be Christ, because she's become different. And that story of the image on the towel survived because the impression made on Veronica herself. But the one who was most like him and grew was Mary, his mother. And I don't think half the time she understood what was happening. She just knew that everyone was against him. When some are for you and some against you, you stand a chance. But the government were against him. The troops were against him. The religious authorities were against him. And all she knew then that the whole world had turned against him. Not the way she brought him up. She didn't understand. All she knew is that she had to stay with him. And her heart was with his. And already she was close to him and she was with God. But in the terrible pain of seeing what was happening to him, again her heart is changed to become more Christ-like. Nobody hit her. Everyone respected her. Or they didn't look at her too much so as not to embarrass her. And they said, poor woman. At the same time, they were striking her son. Oh, they said, what a shame. And at the same time, they were beating her boy, and she followed and wept, and she could do nothing except stay there. She didn't know the way, she just moved on by the crowd until he died. And that was the moment of her total self-giving. The moment of Christ's glory, when he got to this moment of total giving of himself. Thinking of her, think of John, his friend, thinking of the man next to him who's also being crucified. So use Jesus' words, perhaps as a prayer. Remember that man on the cross next to him said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You know, he's the only one in the gospel who called him Jesus. They all called him Lord or Rabbi or Master. But this poor fellow, murderer, condemned to death, said, Jesus, remember me. And then hear Jesus reply, this day you will be with me in paradise. And when Jesus says it to me now, it's not in exactly the same sense as to the man dying. This day you will be with me in paradise, yet he will go to heaven with Christ. But if he says it to me, and I hear Jesus say, this day you will be with me. So if you say, Jesus, remember me, don't worry, he will. Holy Week is a prayer on the love of God, the love of Jesus Christ for each of us personally. The pain might be a measure of it. The suffering may give you some idea. But it isn't the suffering that matters. It is his personal love. And if you want to become like Christ, just read a bit in the Gospel or sit down and see what happened to him and talk to Jesus about it. And you will become like Christ deep in your heart. And at the same time become more yourself, your real self. God bless you and make you another Christ.